A bell above the cafe door chimed against the backdrop of winter wind. She was no taller than the counter, red mittens damp with snow, eyes downcast. The waitress noticed, not because the girl spoke, but because she didn't. The cafe was half lit in the morning hush, windows fogged, the hum of the heater muttering under the hiss of the espresso machine. Outside, snow layered like icing on the town's shoulders, rooftops dipped low with white, and the roads wore tracks like veins under the skin of ice. Ruth wiped down the counter with the practiced grace of someone who'd done it 1,000. Mornings. Mid-30s, shoulder-length chestnut hair tied back, face shaped by sleepless years but softened at the edges. Her eyes, the color of steeped tea, followed the child with quiet curiosity as she slipped inside like a whisper. The girl walked with careful steps, not hesitant but trained. Coat 2 sizes too big. A frayed backpack that sagged like it carried more than school books. She took her usual seat by the window, booth number 4. Never changed, not once, and like every day before, she didn't order. She simply sat. Mittens still, on back straight. Eyes resting not on the people or the falling snow, but on a chipped ceramic mug displayed on the top shelf behind the counter. It was shaped like a bear, half its smile worn away, painted with a crooked evergreen tree. No one ever used it. No one ever moved it. Ruth didn't know why the girl watched it, but every afternoon at 3:12 she came, and Ruth began to wait for it. At first, Ruth thought it would pass, a stray child with no place to go, ducking the cold, but it became a pattern, a ritual. The girl never spoke. She never wrote her name. She only nodded, the faintest dip of her chin, when Ruth placed something warm in front of her. It began with a cocoa. Then, on colder days, grilled cheese. Nothing fancy. Just kindness tucked between slices of sourdough. On the house, Ruth would say gently, setting the plate down. Eat while it's hot. The girl would press her mittened hands against the mug, nod once, and stare out the window, where the snow danced like ash. Ruth never pushed her. Words can be like wind on snow, too strong, and everything collapses. She watched instead, the way the girl's eyes lingered on the door longer when it opened, how she flinched when men walked in wearing heavy boots, how her coat sleeves were sewn clumsily at the ends like someone had tried to make them fit smaller arms. One day, Ruth noticed her own hands shaking as she filled the cocoa. She had been holding the same locket since morning, a silver oval worn soft around the edges, hiding a photograph so faded it barely resembled the boy it held. Her thumb rubbed circles over it without thought. She looked up and caught the girl, staring, not at the bear mug, not at the snow, but at her hands. At the locket, their eyes met, just for a moment, and the girl looked away. The next afternoon, Ruth waited with something different. As the girl settled into her booth, Ruth poured cocoa into a ceramic mug, not the bear one, but close, and carefully unwrapped a grilled cheese. This time she added a square of wax paper folded around something small, a hand warmer. The kind you shake to life. She said nothing as she slipped it into the girl's mitten, just offered a warm smile, her eyes saying, "Here, child. Just in case." The girl didn't react. She didn't even look at her, just stared out the window, mittens still on, steam curling from her cup. But the next day, something changed. It was barely noticeable at first. The girl's posture softer. Her boots carried a trace of dried mud instead of snow. Maybe she had run, maybe not. But in her hand, slightly crumpled and damp at the corners, was a piece of paper. She didn't speak, just walked to the counter, reached up with mittened fingers, and placed the drawing carefully on the surface. Ruth picked it up with quiet hands. It was a pencil sketch, simple, childlike, but unmistakable. Ruth, standing behind the counter, smiling, and the chipped bear mug beside her. In the corner, 2 red mittens drawn side by side. Ruth said nothing, but when she brought the cocoa that day, she placed the sketch in a small frame and set it gently beside the plate. The girl blinked. Just once, and the corner of her mouth twitched, as if remembering how to smile. Snow came harder that week. Blizzards draped the town like a forgotten quilt, and fewer customers wandered into the cafe. But Ruth kept showing up, always at 6 a.m., sweeping the walkway with stiff fingers and setting 2 cups to warm. The girl kept coming too, like clockwork, always at 3:12. But on Thursday, she forgot something. A scarf, faded yellow with tiny embroidered daisies. It had slipped between the booth cushions unnoticed. Ruth found it while cleaning, the cloth still warm with the child's quiet presence. She held it for a moment, fingers tracing the worn embroidery. A name was stitched in cursive on one end, but the thread had frayed too much to read. Instead of tucking it in lost and found, Ruth folded it carefully, as if folding memory, and placed it in booth number 4 the next day, right beside the cocoa. No note. No words. Just a gesture. The girl paused when she saw it. She ran her fingers along the edge, then placed both mittens in her lap, stared down at the scarf, and nodded. Not her usual nod. Something smaller. More fragile. A thank you. Folded inside. A breath. Outside, snowflakes tapped the window like fingers on glass. Inside, the cafe was a cocoon, warm with butter and cinnamon, soft with the hum of conversation and clinking china. Booth number 4 was never empty again. Sometimes the girl brought drawings. Once she left a pressed leaf shaped like a heart. Another time she traced her finger in the condensation on the window. A little bear beside a stick figure woman. Each time, Ruth saved them. Taped them behind the counter. No one else asked about them. No one needed to. It was their language. Wordless, slow, sacred. One evening, long after the cafe had closed, Ruth sat alone by the window, mug in hand, watching the snow drift across the silent street. She pulled her locket open. Inside, a boy, freckled nose, gap-toothed smile, wearing a faded military cap far too big for his head. Her fingers trembled. She closed it gently, held it against her chest, and whispered into the hush. "He would have liked you, little one." The wind sighed through. The cracks in the window. Booth number 4 sat empty, but the scarf remained, folded, waiting. The wind had changed. It whistled lower now, less like song and more like warning. Snow gathered heavier on the cafe windows, curling like breath on glass. The booth by the window no longer looked out onto a bustling street, just an endless white hush. Inside the cafe, time settled differently. Mornings came in muted shades, the bell above the door more familiar than the ticking of the wall clock. Cinnamon rolls stayed in the oven longer, coffee brewed slower. It was a place between worlds, not quite home, but safe. And every day, sometime just after the final school bell, the girl returned. She never announced herself. Her boots left trails of salt and melted snow, her red mittens damp and sagging. She slid wordlessly into the booth by the window, their booth now, always sitting on the left side, as if the right belonged to someone else. Ruth had stopped pretending to wait for an order. The cocoa came first, thick, dark, dusted, with cinnamon, followed by half a grilled cheese. The crusts were always cut off. The girl would nod, small and solemn. Then she'd stare at the chipped mug on the shelf across from her booth. The one with the faded floral rim and a hairline crack near the handle. She never touched it, never asked for it, just stared, as though it anchored her here. One Tuesday, the girl came in soaked through. Snow clung to her lashes. Her scarf was gone. Ruth wrapped a towel around her shoulders and placed her plate in silence. But this time she added a note beneath the grilled cheese. "Good to see you." The girl read it carefully, folded it once, tucked it into her coat pocket. The next day there was no note, just cocoa, just grilled cheese, and yet Ruth found a pebble on the counter when she cleared the plate. Round, flat, the kind children pick up for reasons only they understand. She held it in her hand longer than necessary, slipped it into the tin she kept beneath the register. The next day, another note from Ruth. Snow's heavy today, the girl. Looked up this time, briefly, before folding the note and pressing it to her chest. What followed was a quiet ritual, a dance of napkins and trinkets. Your soup is my favorite. You smell like warm things. Each message from the girl was written in small, deliberate letters. Ruth didn't reply in words anymore. Her answers came in gestures. 2 extra marshmallows, toast shaped like hearts, napkins folded like swans. Underneath the register, Ruth's tin grew heavier. A crumpled paper crane, a pressed violet, the button of a coat too small to be her own. She'd open the tin late at night, long after the cafe had emptied and the floor had been mopped. She'd sit at the counter, touch each item carefully, as if afraid they might disappear. Some nights, she didn't even need to open it. Just knowing it was there was enough. Behind the counter, above the metal locker where Ruth kept her apron and wallet, a yellowing newspaper clipping fluttered gently beneath a magnet. Local soldier missing in action. Family still searching for answers. It had been 9 years. The desert had not been kind. Most people had stopped asking. Even the church had quietly stopped lighting candles. But Ruth remembered, every day. She'd run her thumb along the edge of that clipping, the way someone might trace a scar. Her fingers had memorized the fold in the paper, the date in bold, the photo of a boy in uniform smiling like he wasn't scared. She never cried when she looked at it. Only blinked a little slower, breathed a little quieter. Some afternoons, when the girl was settled in the booth and the cafe was still, Ruth would sit across from her. Not every day, just sometimes. They didn't speak. The silence was soft between them, like fresh snow, like understanding. Once, the girl took off one mitten and held her hand palm up across the table. Ruth hesitated, then placed her own hand atop it. The girl's fingers were cold, so small. Ruth didn't ask, and the girl didn't. Explain, the girl began to draw, always with the same blue pen, always on napkins. At first, it was just shapes, stars, trees, a cup of cocoa with steam like musical notes. Then came the people, stick figures at first. 2 of them, always seated side by side at a table. One had curly hair like Ruth's. The other wore a scarf, the same one she'd left behind, never claimed. Ruth kept every napkin. She flattened them between pages of her ledger. She stopped caring if the numbers didn't add up anymore. One snowstorm closed the school for 2 days. Ruth didn't realize how tightly she held her breath until the girl walked in again, boots scuffed, cheeks red with wind. No words. Just a new drawing. This one was different. The booth. The window. Ruth behind the counter, her face drawn more. Carefully now, eyes soft, mouth tilted in a smile, and behind her, wings, not big, not dramatic, just enough. Feathers curling like breath. Ruth stared at it long after the girl left, long after she'd flipped the sign to closed. She sat on the counter, drawing in her lap, her hands trembling in her apron. The tears came slowly. No sobs, just warmth falling against her cheeks. A strange comfort in it, as though someone had finally noticed she'd been cold all this time. Later that night, she dug through the closet in her apartment, found an old shoebox beneath the blankets. Inside, pressed flowers, dried and brittle, labeled in child's handwriting, "Forget-me-not, from the lake." Daisy, picked, with Mom. Poppy, from the field behind school. She took the girl's violet out of the tin, slid it gently between the last pages of the book, closed it. The label on the final blank page read, "Still blooming." Days passed. The sun never showed. The snow came heavier now, muffling the world. But inside the cafe, the booth with the window glowed. One evening, Ruth lingered by the door, watching the girl from a distance. Something in the girl's posture was different, more grounded, more sure. She'd left something again. Not on the counter this time, but in Ruth's apron pocket. Ruth didn't find it until she got home. A folded square of paper. Inside, a note. "Do you miss someone too?" Ruth held it for a long time, pressed it against her lips, then turned it over and wrote, "Every day." She gave it back the next morning, slid it across the table with the cocoa, no ceremony. The girl read it, folded it, slipped it into her coat like all the others, but this time she looked up, really looked. And in that stillness, Ruth felt the room shift, not a gust of wind, not a tremble, but the beginning of spring, beneath snow. The girl didn't speak, but her eyes did. They said, "I know," and Ruth believed her. That evening, Ruth placed a clean napkin on the booth table and drew her own picture. 2 figures again, but this time they weren't seated. They were walking side by side in the snow. The taller one held a cup of cocoa, the smaller one, a flower, and both of them had wings, not because they were angels, but because somehow, some way, they'd learned how to carry each other. The bell above the cafe door rang, soft and familiar, but this time it wasn't snow that stepped in. It was boots, camouflage, metals catching the dim light, and eyes that were unmistakably hers. Ruth's hand trembled where it gripped the coffee pot. A thin line of steam spiraled into the hush. The man looked around, sharp and steady, then found the girl in the booth by the window. She was already standing, fingers clenched around her coat, wide-eyed. He didn't rush to her. He paused. 2 heartbeats. 3. Then his arms opened and she moved, slow, hesitant, but she went. Not like a child running into safety, but like someone unsure if the door would stay open once she entered it. Their embrace was awkward, his gear stiff, her limbs unsure, but his hand cupped the back of her head. And for a moment, she let her cheek rest against his chest. Then he looked up, at Ruth. Not with anger, not with kindness either. Just a soldier's gaze, measured, assessing, restrained. Ruth stood still behind the counter. The pot of coffee in her hand had stopped trembling. But her chest was thundering. "Been coming here often?" he asked, voice dry, flat. It wasn't a joke, not an accusation either, but something lived between the syllables. Something protective, something unsure. Ruth wiped her hands on her apron. "Yes." He nodded, eyes narrowing slightly. Then, he looked at the booth, the cocoa, the tiny paper heart resting beside the mug, the napkin note folded like a secret between them. The girl stepped back. She looked down. "She sits there," Ruth said quietly. "Always that one. Just cocoa, sometimes soup." He didn't respond, just scanned the space again, then down to his daughter, then back to Ruth. "She talks?" Ruth shook her head slowly. "Not with words." A pause. He swallowed. "Let's go," he said to the girl. She hesitated, not from disobedience, but from fear of leaving something behind. Still, she followed. The door shut behind them, and Ruth stood still, arms crossed, the booth suddenly unbearably empty. That night she closed the cafe early. The cocoa sat untouched on the window table, steam long since vanished into cold. Ruth stood beside it, holding the tiny pressed flower left on the napkin the day before, a daisy, flat and papery, edges curled like shy hands. She placed it in the tin under the register. The next morning she still made the cocoa. She did it the day after that, too, and the one after. 3 days passed. No sign of the girl, no shadow at the window, no note tucked by the plate. Ruth began to wipe the table more often than it needed. She turned the mug slightly every hour, as if angling it just right might summon her back, and then, the 4th morning, there was a letter. Plain envelope, folded neatly, no return address, just "For Ruth," written in sharp, masculine. Pen inside, 1 page, handwritten. She told me about the cocoa, the notes, the booth by the window. She said you never asked her to speak, said you always remembered how she liked her toast, just a little burnt on the edge. I didn't know any of that. I didn't even know she liked toast. I didn't know how to parent silence. Thank you for not filling it with noise. And attached to the note, a drawing, a crayon sketch, the girl, the booth, Ruth behind the counter. The girl had drawn herself smiling. Ruth stared at it for a long time, thumb pressed gently to the paper as if afraid it might fade if she blinked. 2 days later, the bell rang again. Ruth looked up, hopeful. Boots again, camouflage again. But this time, the girl ran ahead of him, straight to the booth. She slid in, coat half unzipped, cheeks flushed from cold and joy. She looked at Ruth like someone seeing their favorite book back on a shelf. Ruth smiled, already reaching for the cocoa. The man followed, slower this time. He didn't hover. He sat across from his daughter, back straight, hands on the table like he didn't quite know what to do with them. "Morning," he said. It was rough, but warmer. Ruth nodded. "Cocoa?" He glanced at the girl. She gave the tiniest nod. "Please," he said. When Ruth brought the mugs, he looked at them, then at the girl, then at Ruth. I don't think she's smiled like that in over a year. Ruth tucked the tray under her arm. "I didn't do much," she said. He looked at the booth, at the shelf near the window, where now sat the paper heart, the pebble, and the sketch, carefully framed in cardboard. "You did enough," he murmured. They stayed an hour. The girl doodled on napkins. The man sipped cocoa slowly, like trying to understand it. Ruth moved through the cafe quietly, but always with a soft glance toward the booth. He watched her too. Not the way men watch women, but the way soldiers watch people. They're not sure they trust yet, but want to. When they left, he stood beside the register for a second too long. Then, from the inside of his jacket, he pulled something small, a worn service patch, dark fabric with gold trim, frayed edges, and his unit's insignia faded from sun and time. "She wanted you to have something of ours," he said. "For the wall." Ruth took it with careful fingers. "I'll put it next to the mug," she whispered. He nodded. "That'd be good." That evening, Ruth placed the patch beside the cocoa mug on the shelf. She didn't wipe the dust away first. She let it sit in the quiet, as if it had always belonged. She stood for a while, staring at the booth by the window. Snow was falling outside. The world muffled again. Still. Hushed. Inside, warmth, cocoa, and a silence full of things unspoken, but deeply understood. The next week, the man came alone. The girl was homesick, he said. He didn't sit in the booth. He sat at the counter this time. "Coffee," he said. "Black." Ruth poured it. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then he spoke. "She stopped speaking after her mom passed," he said, eyes fixed on the rising steam. Ruth said nothing. "She was in the car when it happened. I was deployed. Didn't make it back. In time." Ruth's fingers curled around the rag she was folding. "When I came home, she just wouldn't talk. And I didn't know what to say to make her start again." He took a sip. "I tried school, counselors, family. Nothing held." Then he looked at Ruth. "But you gave her cocoa, and paper, and space." His voice cracked a little. "She needed someone who didn't need an answer." Ruth nodded. "I just recognized something." He tilted his head. "My son," she said. "He loved pressed flowers, too." That was all. She didn't say more. Didn't need to. The silence that followed was deep, reverent, the kind of silence two people share when grief becomes a mutual language. When he stood to leave, he said only, "She'll be back next week. Save her booth?" Ruth smiled. "Always. Bye." The end of winter, the booth by the window had become more than a booth. It was theirs. The cocoa came without asking. New drawings filled the frame. A small pine cone was added to the tin under the register. Ruth never asked what it meant. She just tucked it in gently, like a secret kept safe. Sometimes the man stayed for coffee. Other times, he'd just walk, her in, nod to Ruth, and leave with a grateful glance. The girl still didn't speak, not out loud, but every napkin, every tiny object, every glance held a language Ruth understood now, a language of survival, of slow healing, of things that bloom even in snow. One night, as Ruth swept the floor, she noticed something new under the booth seat, a folded paper, a drawing, this one different. It was the cafe again, the booth, Ruth behind the counter. But this time, she had wings, big ones, gentle arcs of white and gold, not like an angel, more like a guardian. Beneath it, in tiny printed letters, "You are my warm thing." Ruth sat down in the booth. She held the paper to her chest, and for the first time in years, she cried without shame. Not from sadness, but from knowing, truly, knowing that something she thought lost had found its way back, not as it was, but as something new, something small, something sacred, something enough. Spring had started to melt the snowbanks. The sidewalks cracked open with thawed rivulets. The world was stretching again, after so much cold. The bell above the cafe door still chimed, same as always. But today, the booth had 3 cups, instead of 2. Ruth smiled before she even turned around. Subtle clinking of mugs, low background hum of cafe life. The booth was theirs now, not officially, but spiritually. A little girl with quiet eyes sat curled against the window, coloring. A man with a hardened jaw and soft watchfulness sat across from her, sipping his coffee without cream. And Ruth, wiping her hands on her apron, slid over a plate of muffins, without needing to ask. Narrator. They came most mornings now, not every single day, but enough that it mattered. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes the father would just close his eyes, listening to the rustle of paper and the scratch of crayon. Other times, he would ask the girl a question so gently, it was almost a whisper. And now, she answered. Small words at first, then sentences. Then stories. Fade in soft child voice, indistinct storytelling, then fade out. She told Ruth about her stuffed bear, the one she thought she'd lost but found again after the move. She described her favorite dream, where everything was made, of pillows and no one ever yelled. She talked about school in pieces, how it felt different now. Safer. And one day, not in any grand moment but in the middle of sipping cocoa, she called Ruth Auntie. Beat, sound of breath catching, cup clinking slightly as it set down. No one corrected her. Ruth just smiled. Narrator. The father, whose name was Daniel, she'd learned, was still learning to smile back. He wasn't distant, just deliberate. A man who'd lived too long in places where expression cost too much, but he tried. Once, after the heater in the cafe's back room broke, Ruth found him crouched there after hours, sleeves rolled, toolbox in hand. Can't have your hands freezing while you're pouring cocoa, he said without looking up. She brought him a late-night sandwich in thanks. The next morning, a sandwich waited for her instead, wrapped in wax paper. No note, just quietly there. Light acoustic guitar begins, soft rhythm suggesting comfort and routine. Somehow the routines turned into rhythms, and the rhythms turned into rituals. One cold afternoon, when a particularly loud wind shook the cafe windows, Ruth took something from her pocket and knelt beside the booth. It was a locket, worn but polished, gold tone shaped like a teardrop, gentle shift in music, soft strings join. I've had this since I was little, Ruth said. It's empty inside. I kept meaning to put a picture in, but I guess I was waiting for the right one. She opened it for the girl. The girl took it with both hands, reverent, her brow furrowed. Then she reached into her sketchbook, tore a small square from one of her drawings, and folded it perfectly. Inside the locket, a crayon sketch. 3 figures, one tall, one medium, one small, all in a booth, smiling. Music swells gently. Ruth fastened the chain around the girl's neck. The locket settled just beneath her collarbone. "I think it fits now," Ruth whispered. Fade to soft silence. Narrator. A few weeks later, it happened quietly. Ruth was clearing tables near the back when she noticed a folded napkin tucked beneath. Her tip jar. She almost tossed it, thinking it was trash, but the fold was too careful, too intentional. She waited until the cafe emptied out for the morning lull. Then she sat at the counter, unfolded the napkin, and read the message scrawled in purple crayon. Sound of napkin unfolding. Whispered child's voice reading along with the narrator. Narrator. Slow, emotional. "You were the first person who saw me, so I drew a new booth at home. For you. We're saving you a seat." Silence. Then a single, emotional piano note. Narrator. Ruth didn't cry, but her hands trembled the way they had that day in winter, when she'd first seen the girl in the window. She folded the napkin again, carefully, tucked it into her apron, and turned back to the counter with something softer in her expression. That afternoon, she reached for a small nail in a quiet moment. Beneath the mug on the cafe wall, the one reserved for the girl, she added something new. A drawing. 3 figures. And next to it, the napkin, a second seat saved. Gently swelling outro music, uplifting, hopeful, narrator, gentle, inviting. Sometimes all it takes is cocoa, and a booth by the window, and someone who looks twice. If this story touched you, subscribe. Share where you're watching from. Because these stories, they matter. And somewhere, someone is saving you a seat.